I never thought my life would unravel in such a heartbreaking way. I went from feeling on top of the world to living a nightmare. This story took place over the course of almost 5 years, so bear with me as I try to provide a complete context. Let's go back about 5 years. It all started when I discovered the truth about my wife and my best friend's father. Let's call him Jim. Jim had divorced 4 months prior. My wife and I had been married for 14 years, and we have a 13-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son. Our marriage had its ups and downs, like any other couple, and most of our problems revolved around money. We worked for the state of California, where the cost of living is very high. We live in an affluent neighborhood, not because we are wealthy, but because the neighborhood gentrified and we moved in. My house has been in the family since the 1940s, handed down from my father, who inherited it from his father. Many people have tried to convince me to sell, including my wife, but I refused because it holds sentimental value. Raising my children in an affluent neighborhood means that we are surrounded by wealthy neighbors. Our children grew up with wealthy kids, and my wife and I had comparably low incomes. We always felt like we couldn't provide the best things for our children because they wanted to keep up with what their friends had. One day, my 11-year-old son came home with an expensive handheld game console that Jim had bought him as a Christmas gift. I couldn't afford to buy it for him because other things took priority. At first, I thought he had borrowed it from his friends, but when he hadn't returned it after 2 days, I asked him about it. He told me that Jim had bought it for him after asking him what he liked the most, and he mentioned the video game. I didn't know how to feel about it, whether to thank Jim or feel bad that I couldn't buy the console for my son without ruining myself financially. The next time I saw Jim at a volleyball match, where my wife usually takes my daughter, they approached him and he thanked my wife. Jim seemed like a nice guy, tall and fit. He was older than me but appeared younger, maybe because he exercised regularly. He came to the volleyball match with his daughter, and when he saw me there, he asked about my wife. I told him she was doing well. When I went home that day, I mentioned to my wife that I had met Jim. Just mentioning his name made my wife's eyes light up. It was quite noticeable, and I wanted to know what she thought of him. It was clear that she held him in high regard, but I couldn't guess anything beyond that. When we got married, we were the attractive couple that everyone talked about, but since we had children, we strayed from our path a bit. 3 months ago, my wife started exercising and training for a marathon. She would come home and talk about dropping off our daughter at her friend's house and how she would spend hours talking about fitness with Jim. It seemed innocent, and she spoke openly about it. Her friend's daughter is friends with my daughter, so it wasn't strange for my wife to drop off and pick up my daughter from Jim's house. However, I recently noticed that she seemed more excited when she talked about Jim. I had a feeling that something wasn't right, so I started paying close attention to my wife. That's when I realized how often she took my daughter to Jim's house. Before, she used to drop her off and come back to run errands, but now she would leave my daughter there and stay home. I installed a GPS tracker in her car to see where she went after parking her car in the same place until it was time for my daughter to come home. I didn't want to ask her why she was spending hours at Jim's house with my daughter because I didn't want to seem accusatory. I intentionally brought up Jim's name in conversation, and she would get excited and talk for hours about how great he is, how intelligent, how much money and property he has. She would tell me things that made me believe she was showing off in front of him. I put on my detective glasses and searched her phone for any clues. To my surprise, I found out that she was texting him more than anyone else. They were sending heart emojis and calling each other "my love." This hurt me and made me feel betrayed. It was clear that the affair had been going on for at least 7 or 8 months. Perhaps this was the reason Jim got a divorce. When I confronted her about the texts, she confessed to the affair but didn't want to admit when it started. She pleaded for my forgiveness, saying it was a mistake, but I didn't believe her. We discussed what should happen to our relationship, and I told her to leave for a while so we could have space to think. The affair had lasted so long that I couldn't bear the betrayal. After kicking my wife out of the house, I told my children that my wife and I were having marriage problems, but didn't mention the affair or say anything bad about their mother. The first time I realized that my wife had poisoned my daughter's mind was when my daughter started being unnecessarily rude to me. I punished her by taking away her phone, which made her even angrier. She said she would buy herself another phone, a better one. Her statement hurt me deeply, and I felt like I was losing control of my family. 2 days after my wife left, I saw on the GPS tracker that her car had been parked at Jim's house overnight. That was the death sentence for our marriage. Any hope of reconciliation vanished. I may not have money, but I have dignity, and I wouldn't allow myself to be humiliated like that because of money. There are things in life that are more important than money, like loyalty, integrity, and honesty, all of which my wife had broken. I called her and told her I was divorcing her. She showed no remorse. Instead, she sent me a text message saying she was done with me. There are no words to explain how I felt inside. I was visibly depressed and didn't eat for 3 days. I felt like a robot, just going through the motions of life. I did everything I could to take care of my children, but she destroyed everything to start anew with another man. Not only had she falsely accused me, but now she had taken my children away and gotten a restraining order against me. My family and friends told me to control myself and not do anything irrational. I focused on my work and ignored my family for months. I felt better without them in my life. After the divorce, my wife bought a new car and quit her job to become a stay-at-home mom in her new blended family. It was Jim and his 3 kids, all teenagers. I worried that my 13-year-old daughter was living in a house with 2 unrelated boys, and I felt powerless to do anything about it. 4 months after the divorce, I was in the best place of my life. I made new friends and went on dates. I felt that the divorce and custody arrangement favored me because I had a lot of free time, but I still felt empty inside. I missed the process of raising my children. I missed hearing their voices around the house, so I started visiting my son during his school recess. He ran to me as fast as he could and hugged me tightly. We went to the bank, and he told me everything that happened at Jim's house and all the toys and video games they played. He seemed happy and healthy, and wanted to know when he could come back home. Tears filled my eyes at the realization that despite my financial insufficiency, my son still thought about coming back home, even if he had to live in Disney World. That day, I went home as a proud father, telling my son not to mention our visit to his mother or his sister, but that I would visit him at least once a week. As time went on, I visited my son at least once a week, spending a few minutes with him before he returned to class. On one of those visits, he mentioned that he had caught my daughter wiping away tears from her eyes as if she had been crying. I didn't make a big deal out of it. It could have been anything. On another occasion, he told me that he had caught my ex-wife crying several times. I asked him why she was crying, and he said she was angry as Jim had done something to her. I asked all kinds of questions that I had no idea about. When I got home, I was happy because there were problems in paradise. It pleased me to know that the only time I made her cry was when I caught her cheating. I felt better knowing that she was no longer my problem. Then, one day, I received a call from an unrecognized number. When I picked up the phone, the caller hung up. This happened for several days. I decided to call the number back, but no one answered. It didn't happen again for a few days, and then the same pattern repeated. They would call, I would answer, and they would hang up. I had a feeling that it could be my daughter, so I used another phone to return the call, and indeed my daughter answered on the other end. She immediately hung up. I knew something was wrong for her to call me. My mind wasn't sure what was going on. Not wanting to jump to conclusions, I went after her with so many questions. We planned to meet at a park to talk. As we sat on the bench, she was distant and didn't seem happy. She had changed physically and dressed well, but she didn't seem happy. I couldn't help but ask her why she hated her mother so much, why she had been like this for so long. Her demeanor changed, and then she angrily told me that she had confided in my ex-wife about what her disgusting boyfriend had done to her, and that she had covered it up. I was in shock as she got up and stormed back inside, leaving me confused. It took me a few minutes to process what she had just told me, and my mind wondered what she meant by that. Not wanting to jump to conclusions, I got up and followed her, urging her to explain what she meant. She struggled but finally revealed that the person who had gotten her pregnant wasn't Jim's son, but Jim himself. Apparently, he had been buying her silence since she became friends with his daughter and ultimately got her pregnant after she moved in with him. It seemed like a calculated move from the beginning. When she found out she was 2 months pregnant, she panicked and told my ex-wife. Instead of protecting her, my ex-wife was more concerned with keeping me in the dark. My ex-wife eventually confronted Jim, but they kept it behind closed doors and convinced her to terminate the pregnancy. I immediately went to the police with my daughter, and we filed a report. Jim had already moved out of the neighborhood, but they arrested him at his new house, and later on my ex-wife as well. She took a plea deal, confessed, and testified in court. She received a short 6-month sentence in probation. Jim was sentenced to 22 years in prison, and I will do everything in my power to make sure his fellow inmates know what he did. Thank you for listening to my story. If you were in a similar situation, how would you handle it? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and take care. See you next time on